Cars Garage. In this video, I'll be working on the Team Associated B6.4 Bag 9. So let's get started. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is install the pistons onto the shock shafts. So the longer shafts are for the rear, the shorter shafts are for the front. The longer shafts are 27.5 millimeters and the short shafts are 21 millimeters. So in order to install the pistons on the shafts, we're going to need our pistons themselves. And take note, there's going to be two different size pistons. We're going to have a 1.6 piston. See if that'll focus. And we'll have a 1.7 piston right there. So the 1.6 pistons install on the front and the 1.7s install on the rear. We're going to need an M2x4 button head cap screw for each shock shaft. So 4 total, and we're going to need 4 2.5 millimeter washers. And the way these are going to install is first you're going to put the washer on there, and I like to put the smoother side of the washer facing down. Then I'll install the piston, and you want to install the piston with the numbering facing up. Another thing that you can do is use a Sharpie or something and mark the 1.6 or 1.7, so that way you know what size piston is in there. But I tend to know what I'm running, so I don't usually mark my stuff. Next, we're going to install the M2x4 millimeter button head cap screw, and I like to install this screw with some blue Loctite. It's not mentioned in the manual, but I have seen these screws back out, so this is extra insurance that you are able to finish your mains. And you don't want to over tighten this screw because you can warp the piston. So once it's snug, that's good. And that Loctite will help it stay in place. So this one's done. We can go ahead and do the others. So the shock shafts and pistons are now ready. Now we can prepare our shock bodies. Now the front and rear shock bodies are different. The front shock bodies are 23 millimeters and the rears are 27.5 millimeters. So you can tell a difference because one is taller than the other. They're both gonna assemble in the same manner. So for the large 13 millimeter O-rings, I like to use just some shock fluid to lubricate the O-rings. And we're going to put one 13 millimeter O-ring on the top. Then on the bottom, it doesn't give the size, but this smaller black O-ring is going to install on the bottom of the shock. And just going to put a little bit of shock fluid on there, just like so. Next, we're going to need our shock bushings. So we're going to need 2 hat bushings and 1 shock spacer per shock. So we can get those off the parts tree. So this is the shock hat bushing. You can see there's like it looks like a little hat. And then this is the shock bushing. So just take note of that. And we're going to need 2 X-rings per shock. So make sure you're using the X-rings. This is an X-ring right here. It's rubber, it's flexible. There's other pieces that are in that bag. These are what we use for shock limiting, and these are not flexible. I've seen people use these instead of the X-rings. These do not seal, so take note of that and make sure you use the correct part. And you can use some green slime, or I like to use this Premier Blue Protec O-ring grease. Ever since I started using this, I've never had a shock leak on me. So what I like to do is I like to put this grease on everything that's going into this bottom part. So when we install the first shock hat bushing, we're going to put the smaller diameter into the shock first. And make sure it sits nicely in there, because that smaller diameter actually matches up with the hole in the shock, and it'll sit in there and try to keep everything centralized. Next, we're going to install one of the X-rings, and what I like to do with this is I just use the syringe and inject the grease into the inside, make sure everything's covered until it starts leaking out from behind, and then I just cover it up completely and then install it. And don't be shy with this O-ring grease, because it'll help seal everything. Next, we're going to install the shock spacer, and same thing here. I like to make sure that this is covered in O-ring grease as well, just to give some lubrication so that when the shock does rub on it, it is lubricated. Next, we're going to install another X-ring. And then the last shock hat bushing, and this one is going to be facing the opposite direction with the smaller diameter facing away from the X-ring. And then now we can install the shock bottom cap. And I don't like to thread this all the way down. I'll kind of get it close to the O-ring and I'll leave it there. So we're going to do the same thing for all the other shocks. I'll do it real quickly and then we can move on. Now we can move on to the next step, which is bag 9 step 3. We're going to go ahead and install the shock shaft and pistons into the shock bodies, and then install the shock eyelets and pivot balls. So we have our front shocks, and in the manual it says to either use some green slime or shock oil. What I like to do is use shock fluid on the shock shaft itself and the threads. And then when I install the shock shaft and I feel the shaft going through the X-rings, I like to rotate the shaft and then push it in. I rotate it in a, if you're looking from the top, clockwise direction, then push it through. And then I'll wipe off any excess grease that comes out, and then I'll go ahead and tighten up the bottom shock cap, just like so, and that feels amazingly smooth. It's exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them, and then we'll install the shock eyelets and pivot balls. There we go. Every shock moves nice and smooth. It's exactly what we want. There you go. Now the front shock eyelets are going to be the +2 millimeters, and the rear shock eyelets are going to be the +4 millimeters. So if you look on the parts tree, they are labeled. These are the +4. You can see the 4 on there, and this is the +2. So we can go ahead and get these off the parts tree. All right, so we're going to install the +2 shock eyelets on the front and the +4s in the rear. So what I'm going to do is apply some light oil on these threads to help make it easier to install. And this is one of the things that seems a little different than the B6.3. Aside from the 13 millimeter shocks, we didn't install any of the limiters, internal or external. And then the front stroke is 21 millimeters and the rear stroke is 27.5. And I know that the B6.3 had a different stroke, front and rear. I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of them. Don't skip setting the stroke for each of the shocks, because that plays a huge part in the weight transfer on how quickly the car will accelerate and also brake in terms of steering. It's a complicated subject, but it does make a difference, so definitely make sure you take the time and set the stroke. Alright, so all the shock eyelets are installed. Now we can install our pivot balls. So you're going to need some shock pliers for this. So now we're ready to fill up the shocks. And we're going to use 35 weight in the front and 30 weight in the rear. So I'm going to use my shock vacuum. This is a Ride Racing Team shock vacuum. It's actually owned by Schumacher. There's a Tamiya one that I can link in the description below that's very similar. That'll probably work just as well. I do a lot of builds and I rebuild a lot of shocks, so this has been a lifesaver for me. So 35 weight in the front and 30 weight in the rear. So because these shocks are larger, we can go down on weight on the shock fluid. In the B6.3, the shock fluid was 45 in the front and 35 in the rear, if I'm not mistaken. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cycle the shocks about 20 times each, and while I do that, I'm rotating the shaft so I can get all the air below the piston to come out. Make sure you don't push the piston too far up and get more air underneath. So for this particular shock pump, I like to do 10 pumps and then I'll let it sit and let the air escape. So now there's vacuum in there, and you can see, kind of hard to see, but you can see the bubbles escaping. So I'm going to let that sit to the side while I prepare for the next steps. So we can get our threaded shock collars ready. We're going to need the 13mm O-rings for this, and we're going to put a light coat of shock fluid on these O-rings, and then we're going to install the O-rings in the groove. That's in the shock collar. So the shock collars are now ready. We can set these aside. Now we can prepare the shock caps and spring cups. So we're going to need 4 of the shock caps so we can get them off the parts tree. So to prepare the shock caps, we want to take the M2x4 button head cap screw, and we want to just start the threads, so that way when we do the bleeding process, it'll make it a little easier. So you're just going to do a few turns. We're not going to go all the way down. So that one's ready. All right, next we're going to get the shock spring cups ready. The front is going to use the 5mm spring cup, and the rear is going to use the 0mm spring cup. So they're not marked, but this is the 0mm spring cup, this is the 5, and this is the 9. So these can be used as a tuning option, but for now we're going to be using the 0 and 5. All right, and now our spring cups are ready. So I can go ahead and check on our shocks. I like to cycle them a few more times and try to get more air out. I'm going to wait for the air to escape out of those shocks, and then I'll be right back. Alright, so the shocks have been vacuumed and sitting for a while, so there's no air bubbles left. So now we can fill them up and start the bleeding process. So the method that I use to bleed my shocks is different than what's in the manual, and I find it to be more consistent in the bleeding process and making sure that each shock is relatively the same and consistent. So what I'll do is add a little bit of shock fluid in my shock cap, and then I'm going to go ahead and install my shock cap onto my shock. You can see some fluid starting to come out. I want to use the included wrench that came in just to snug it up. I don't like to tighten it too much because you can damage the O-ring. So let's set this over here. So now what we're going to do is slowly compress the shock and capture some of this oil, this shock fluid that's going to come out. So I like to angle up the shock just a little bit. You'll see some air bubbles come out and any excess shock fluid. So it's fully compressed. Now we can go ahead and install our M2x4 button head cap screw. Slowly screw in this screw. Be careful not to over tighten it because you'll end up stripping the shock cap, which will allow air into the shock. So it's installed, it's shouldered up. And now what I like to do is I'll quickly cycle the shock about 20 times and then see if it builds up any pressure and make sure that it's a dead shock. So you can see I've cycled it. It's not building up pressure and it didn't rebound that much. So we can consider this a dead shock. So this shock is done. We can move on to the rest of them. So you're going to follow the same process for doing all the shocks. So all the shocks are now bled, and we can go ahead and assemble them and put them on to the chassis. So one thing to note in the bleeding process that I'm showing you, if for some reason you cycle it 20 times and it rebounds a lot, all you have to do is extend the shock, open up the bleed screw, do the bleeding process again, basically compress the shock, make sure any air or fluid comes out, and then put the bleed screw back in, cycle it 20 times or so, and then see if it rebounds some more. So that's the bleeding process that I would recommend. So now we can go ahead and install our shock collars that we've prepared already. So according to the kit setup, we're going to have a 4mm gap between the top of the shock here and the shock collar. Not too concerned with the gap at this moment, and just because once you install your electronics, all your electronics are going to be different than what I'm using, and so when you set your ride height, you're going to have to adjust this anyway. So, but this is a good place to start out. So what I like to do is actually, I will turn it the opposite way of tightening, and you'll feel the collar kind of jump, and that's the start of the thread. So it makes it easy for you to not cross thread. for the front shocks, the gap between the shock body and the shock collar is supposed to be 4.5 millimeters. So now we can go ahead and completely assemble the shock. So we're going to be using the shorter springs that came in the kit. They're red. These are going to be for the front. This is the front shock. So we can go ahead and install the spring. I like to put the color indication on the top because it's easily identifiable. And then we're going to use the 5mm spring cup on the bottom. There we go. For the rear, looks like the springs are blue, almost looks like a purple color to me, but we're going to do the same thing, install with the blue indication on the top, and then install it with the 0mm spring cup on the bottom. Now we can grab our chassis and install the shocks. So most of the time they tell you to install the bleeder screw facing the inside, so that way no dirt gets into it. But since it's a carpet car, I'm not worried about dirt getting into it. So I actually like to keep the bleeder screw facing out in case I want to bleed it while it's on the car. Usually I don't, I'll take it off, but that's just the way that I do it. So we're going to install it on the shock bushing on the top and on the outside most hole in the control arm. And the way that I like to install it is have the flange side of the pivot ball facing the rear of the car. So we're going to install using the M3 flange lock nut on the top, and we're going to use the M3x20 button head cap screw on the bottom. You don't want to over tighten this because you are going into plastic. And remember, you're going to go on the outermost hole. The front is installed. Now we can move on to the rear. The rear, the shock bushings are installed on the top, and we have the stud on the bottom. So we're just going to install again with the bleeder screw facing up or outside of the vehicle, and we want to face the flange portion of the pivot ball towards the arm itself. And we're going to use 2 M3 flanged nylock nuts to install each shock. And I find it easier to install the top of the shock first while having the shock in this position so you have room for your wrench. Okay. And then what I like to do is double check to make sure that the nylock on the flange nut is engaged on that stud, and it is, so we're good. Go ahead and install the other side. And there we go. So that concludes bag 9, the shocks. Everything moves nice and smooth. I'm absolutely in love with these shocks. Like I said, the main reason I bought this car because I enjoyed these shocks so much on the B6.4. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. Leave any comments down below if you had any issues. I'll do my best to help you out if I can. Stay tuned for the next video, which is going to be bag 10, which is going to be the end of this build series where I install the electronics. So thanks again, and I'll see you all in the next one.